Alright everybody, welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are in Age of Wonders 4 about to kick off our General Primal Build Guide. Now this is going to be sort of like the General Industrious Build Guide we did from 10,000 years ago, but rather than focusing on a lot of different builds and just like ways that you can use Industrious, what I think we're going to learn a lot more from is if we just talk about one build in particular and we dissect that build, so that way you understand not just what the build is doing, but what it's trying to accomplish. So that way you can try to accomplish similar things using very different tools, which is, I think, like really the creative force behind Age of Wonders 4. You can be really fun and do a lot of role-playing things as long as you do your homework pretty well. And this video really is just going to be geared towards helping people do their homework on Primal, because Primal is one of those things that is incredibly complicated. I would say that overall it's pretty easy to just shuffle them to the background and say, well, they're weak, they don't perform particularly well in auto-resolves, and they do have some issues in terms of multiplayer scaling because of the way that summons work, but that's like kind of only partially true because primals really do have a lot of strengths as well. It's just a question of like, how do you leverage them, how do you contextualize their strengths, and how do you do your best as a player to limit their weaknesses. So part of what makes Primal so complicated is that, you know, most of the time whenever I'm trying to look at a faction and trying to understand how to make their economy work, I'm going to start by looking at their cultural units, because the cultural units that you start with are like the basic core of your military, which, because that is the core of your economy, that dictates the way that you grow. But primals are so complicated that you really can't do that. We really do have to have a conversation here, starting with the different primal animals, which I know that people are probably excited about anyway, but I like to try to focus the videos on the things that are important because I'm going to ramble a lot, but I really cannot skip primal animals, and these things are so unbelievably important on your snowballing patterns that we probably need to talk through most of them, just in terms of like how you need to understand and contextualize the bonuses that they're giving you and the impact, more importantly, on map generation. I went back and forth on whether or not I wanted to talk about widgets first, but I think that MapGen, because of the way that it influences your ability to snowball in any 4X, but especially a military-focused one like Age of Wonders 4, really is the first thing that we need to contextualize here, because it'll help you immediately understand that some of these primal animals are a lot easier to work in multiplayer than others. So the first thing you gotta know is that swamp provinces are going to be generating a lot of slowed movement for everybody. They're going to be adding potentially even extra rivers, but most importantly, it's going to be adding lots of opportunity for extra lightning damage. This is something where you as the player can actually manipulate Mire Crocodiles to being more useful for you if you lean into what is going to be happening in combat. If you can just start chucking down, you know, lightning torrents on units that are going to be weak because of the terrain that they're going to be encountering in auto resolves, and then just walking up with lightning blades, your autos are going to be pretty good with Mire Crocodiles as long as you give them what they're asking for. But then that also kind of leads you in the same path to understanding what my problems are with Glacial Mammoth, for instance. If you play enough with Glacial Mammoths or just, you know, any sort of cold start, you'll immediately notice that the things that are generated around you are not random, they're semi-random. You're going to be seeing a lot of extra units with extra cold resistance, with frozen immunities. You're going to see the same sort of problems here with Ash Sabertooth, where they're going to be trying to bring a lot of fire damage in against a lot of things that are resistant to fire. And so understanding that just looking at the raw numbers alone is not going to tell you the whole story, because your first 5 auto-resolves are really important when it comes to multiplayer, and making them harder on you is not going to make your life any easier, I promise. So understanding that the scaling that you're getting is going to be coming not just out of, you know, the values of the widgets associated with the favored terrain, but the impact on your ability to just keep fighting. Underground is still sort of one of these issues where it's still pretty rude to anyone if anybody brings underground because of the way that it shrinks the map. And then Sylvan Wolf, this is, you know, another one of these things where there's second layer understandings on MapGen. You're gonna get all of the terrain types that you want near you So Stormcrows and Sylvan Wolves, for instance, get some pretty meaningful movement boosts. This is kind of why Stormcrows ultimately, which we will discuss when we get to Widgets, was one of them that multiplayer people really focused on. The grassland walk ability of going from 6 to 4 movement points and then getting the extra movement points for moving through friendly terrain means that when you're playing with Stormcrows, you kind of feel like you're always on the warpath, always playing with Swift March. But then you also see things like the Dune Serpent compared to Ash Sabertooth, and people often, like say, all right, well, one bonus is just higher than the other, why would you care? Well, Ash Sabertooth has a second problem in addition to their damage just being like mismatched versus the things they're trying to kill early game. They also don't get Foresters most of the time, and if you do not have a Forester playing as Primals, you are in a lot of trouble, because you need a Forester for your workshop on turn 1. So if you do not get one, rip in peace. So basically, to break it down in terms of map gen and the way that influences your play patterns with Primals, Stormcrows, I think, are still probably the best, but we have a lot of fun tools to play around with whenever it comes to utilizing blind. So we're going to be pretending like we're playing Dune Serpents in this this sort of walkthrough whenever we're talking about ways to analyze and think about the strengths of the units themselves. Oh, of course, before we talk about the widgets, I do also want to talk about the different summons very briefly. I don't think that there's really a big difference between the different summons. I think the different summons all function basically in the same way, where they're a really good stopgap measure against someone trying to rush you. Primals are just kind of always going to have a rough early game because of the way that their unit roster works, but having access to a summon is actually a really good tool for encouraging other players not to kill you while you are struggling to keep up with them on the map, and get your good stuff online. So I don't think it really matters if one of the summons is marginally better than the other. Just like lean into the different strengths of them and realize that like they're more defensive tools than they are offensive ones, until you are ready to attack, right? Until you have all of your good pieces online, and then you can use them also as like a good form of creating like action point pressure. So they do scale like relatively poorly. I'm not going to focus on that. I think the more important thing to focus on is the way that the different widgets actually influence the values here on the primal animals, in addition to that map gen thing. So how does the widget economy here work for Primals? Well, the first thing you need to know is that you're not actually just getting paid this value on terrain territory controlled by your cities. It's any terrain that you're controlling at all right now. I think this is just like a really good thing because it helps people understand the differences between city control and outpost control, but outposts are a huge part of the game in Age of Wonders 4. If you're not building a lot of them, you should start doing that. And that means that ultimately the widgets that are associated purely with cities are generically a little worse. You're not going to be getting like 10,000 population on turn 10 in your city. Hopefully you have better things to do with your resources than turbo max pop, but you'll see pretty quickly that like things that pay you out in global resources, that is mana, and of course gold and knowledge, those are the things that just scale the best. There are some good arguments for specific types of widgets. This is why people do also like Sylvan Wolf. Not only does the wolf actually contribute pretty meaningfully to combat whenever somebody tries to rush you down, but +3 draft is just like a really nice bonus overall. But because Dune Serpents and Tunneling Spiders and Sabertooths, I guess, and Stormcrows all get something out of their outposts versus the Mammoths and the Crocodiles and the other guys, those are the ones that I think generically are always going to be stronger in any sort of multiplayer or auto-resolve function, because you're gonna have a lot of outposts. It's just the way the game works, and these pay you out for those. Alright, so now that we're done talking about the city economy here with Primals, we can focus on the thing that really makes them challenging in multiplayer, which is their military economy. So one of the things you need to keep in mind is that you cannot judge units in a vacuum. Nothing exists in a vacuum in Age of Wonders 4, especially if you're doing auto-resolves. You need to know that like it's not total war nonsense, it actually fights the battles out. And so the way that the units perform in combat not only is influenced by their numbers, numbers, but the behaviors of the other units in combat, the way they support each other, the way they use their abilities to buff each other and get you really good auto-resolves. And that's kind of like where the Primal package really does not function, at least in the early game, because of things like the Protector. So if we just look at the Protector and we purely judge this thing from like a stat perspective, and we look at Dawn Defenders as a comparison, then you'd be like, all right, well, the numbers are effectively the same. They're both optional cavalry. They both have some little dingly bops. They probably do about the same in combat. But if you watch enough auto-resolves, you know that is so far from the truth that it's crazy. Dawn Defenders do not have the same sort of like really good area of control CC effects that you get on Anvil Guards or on the Barbarian Warriors, but it kind of doesn't matter, because the thing that the high Dawn Defenders do is inflict dead on stuff, because they get extra spirit damage on top of this. And because of the way that combat works in Age of Wonders 4, where when an opponent has fewer models, they're going to deal less damage, having a unit that can just like bulldoze enemy units in melee is really, really powerful. And then of course you also have to like take into effect the actual widgets in combat that they're getting from being buffed by each other, and getting +1 defense and +2 resistance allows the Dawn Defenders to lose fewer models on the first hit, and then the extra spirit damage lets them just chew through on the fight. So that's like the head here for Primals, is that you really need to stop judging things assuming that all of the information is right here, because it's really not. Combat is very complicated in Age of Wonders 4, both in manuals as well as auto-resolves, and so understanding the context of pure numbers alone do not tell you a story is really powerful. Protectors are basically just hit points. That's really all they do. They don't tend to protect your other units, and that can cause cascading problems for you in the early game, where like they're there, and yeah, they're keeping themselves alive pretty well, but they're not keeping anybody else alive, and without anybody else alive, your early game auto-resolves are going to be a bit of a mess. So Primal Darters, they're cool. I think that these are a great opportunity for you to experiment with the Ritualist ability that gives you extra like overgrowth, because these things do have the ability to ignore covering unit penalties. So if you can want to manipulate these things into being better, I would start there. But ultimately, if you just like compare these things in terms of both their design as well as their function to something like the Skirmisher on Barbarians, the Sunderer. Sunderers obviously just like dramatically outperform them under virtually all circumstances. So they have a little bit of issues there, complete on their tier 1 package. And then their tier 2 package is also not particularly good, partially because of stats, but partially because of behaviors. So if you've played enough around with like different things in auto-resolve only, or just even auto-resolve mostly, you'll get used to the idea that there are just going to be a lot of tier 2 polearms wandering around on the board. That's just like a consequence of the way that MapGen works. It'll just spawn a lot of different types of units, and because there are just a lot of tier 2 polearms, generically you'll find that things like tier 2 shock units just aren't as good, and that is a big problem for Primal Chargers, because like you're gonna need a frontline or at least something to keep you alive with Primals, and trying to rely on these guys is usually a losing proposition. You can make them better with athletics, and on that note, you can attempt to make Protectors better by utilizing this optional cavalry tag, but you'll find pretty quickly, or at least I found pretty quickly, that it's just not worth the effort, that like these are not the real strength of Primals. And so what I try to do is, rather than like limit the weaknesses, is just kind of like skip past them and get to the good stuff, and that just means like neglecting your early game is something. Athletics is probably like the best option if you're thinking about maximizing your movement speed early game, because it does scale really well into the mid. But like all these optional cavalry tags kind of don't matter that much. And then we hit like the real behavioral problems for Primals, which are the Animists themselves. So understanding your support unit is one of the most important things whenever it comes to making the switch from doing mostly manuals to doing mostly auto-resolves or pure auto-resolves, because of the importance of a support unit on your ability to clear. Anything that gives you extra temporary HP is going to allow you to take fight after fight after fight, which is really what you want to be doing. If you can get into 3 fights per turn instead of 2, that's better. And if you can get to 15 fights per turn, then I guess at me. But like, you really just want to be getting into as many fights as you can, and that means understanding the real value of your support unit. When it comes to like manual fights against the map, people are probably used to just dumping all of the healing and stuff onto the Animist, having the Animist summon, then the enemy AI will just focus down that summon, and it's sort of like you got to take a fight for free. But when it comes to auto-resolves, you need to understand that behaviors are way more important than just raw numbers, and the behaviors on Animists are not going to produce that sort of effect for you, I promise. Because what's going to happen is it's going to pick a unit that needs to be healed, because that's just like the right moral thing for your support unit to do, but it means that if you want your auto-resolve to pick the Animist, that you have to like borrow a strategy from Pokemon speedrunning called redlining, and only have an injured Animist to guarantee that your auto-resolve puts heals onto this. But if you're doing that, then you're probably not taking a lot of fights per turn, and that means that your economy is just not growing particularly quickly. So Animists are not going to be these like monstrous summoning forces that you're used to if you're doing a lot of auto-resolves. They're just sort of like an underwhelming healer with an underwhelming buff. Unfortunately, one of the other problems for Primals in the early game, something that gets a lot better in the late game, but in the early game, the Rising Fury thing, it really doesn't pay you out, because you end up in these fights where they're always over by like turn 4, and maybe you get one attack off with the Rising Fury, whereas like all of the other factions that are utilizing buffs are actually getting their buffs online. I don't know how to adjust that. Maybe they could like bring that down to 3 stacks for the thing instead of 5, or maybe 4. I don't know. It just seems like it's a little much, because they just really do not get good value out of them early on. And so what we've described here, I hope highlights that if you're going to be playing with Primals, you're going to have really hard early game auto resolves. You need to do your best to be very careful though, because the highlight here is that Ancestral Wardens kind of make the all of the early game problems go away if you can stay alive. These are one of the best cultural tier 3 units in the game. So let's talk about Ancestral Wardens. So Ancestral Wardens really are kind of like the payoff for playing as Primal, in my opinion. Most of the rest of their roster doesn't function particularly well, but their economy does scale relatively well into the mid-game, and so if you can stay alive and not fall dramatically behind, then you can start having a pretty big economy to play around with the stronger stuff. And I really think that these are the stronger stuff for a lot of different reasons. First, of course, that they are a tier 3 polearm. If you've never used a polearm, then like you should probably play around with Pyro Templars. They're pretty good. But even Ancestral Wardens just kind of like show off how unbelievably sick they are whenever it comes to like a fight against another player, because retaliation attacks allow you to hit first, which is gonna, strip models over most of the enemies. Like once you're rocking with Ancestral Wardens, be aware you'll encounter, single model entities like Evolved Snow Spirits. So you're not gonna get this effect on everything, but on a meaningful number of units, you're gonna hit them first, kill a model, then you'll take less damage, and then because these are gonna be polearms that hopefully you're getting extra retaliations on or something like that, you can hit them back again, and then you can just start like dumpstering enemies who are trying to punish you. And you can do it with incredible amounts of resiliency thanks to Primal Lunge. And this is a tool that the AI actually gets great value out of in auto-resolves because it lands you in the defense mode. This thing not only doesn't get your unit killed, but because it's hitting this AoE, it's actually going to do really great work for you. You do need to do your best to make sure that if you're utilizing Ancestral Wardens, that you're supporting them properly. That means typically just getting as many of them as you can, simply because they do work better in tandem with one another. If one of them is jumping into melee and getting surrounded by the entire army, one of them can die pretty quickly. If 5 of them are, then your enemy is gonna die pretty quickly. So Ancestral Wardens, the real headliner here is you need to be very careful when you're playing with Primals, because you do not want to like neglect your early game when it comes to your autos. You need to make sure that you have enough resources that you can stay alive, but you also need to make sure that you are getting through to Ancestral Wardens as quickly as humanly possible. Do not like overcommit resources to underwhelming units. Do your best to preserve your gold resources, so that way whenever you get a Town Hall 3 online in your capital, or if you're lucky enough to find a tier 3 free city, just conquering it and migrating it over to you. You just want to start dumping Ancestral Wardens onto the board as soon as you can, and that will dramatically improve your auto resolves and of course make you a real menace whenever it comes to like a mid-game fight, which I do think is like where I would generally recommend primals, especially something like the build that we are about to discuss here. I think you're going to want to be doing mid-game fights rather than late-game fights. You can move this around by doing a very different build here, but I think this one is going to be geared towards just killing people with Ancestral Wardens, because that is definitely my vibe. So we're going to start here just by discussing the build within the game itself, but because I do think that Joyce's database is just like a much handier tool for describing what is actually happening in the game, we are going to switch over to that in a very short order. But I wanted to introduce our build that we're going to be playing around with today, which is Dragon Faldorn. So for those of you who've played the Baldur's Gate series, especially 1 and 2, you'll remember that there is an evil shadow druid, Faldorn, who takes over the druid circle like right outside of Trademeet. And so this is sort of just like, all right, well, what if Faldorn, instead of like transforming into a stupid cat or whatever whenever you go to kill her, transforms into a dragon? So that's going to be the core of what we're trying to represent. Your goal is to become a nature apocalypse and destroy people as quickly as you can, because as we'll discuss whenever we switch over to the database, the different affinities are going to have pretty meaningful differences in terms of when you are strong. And when it comes to 4Xs, you really want to attack when you're strong. You do not want to wait around for your opponent to get as powerful as you are. If you have an advantage and you do not have a long-term advantage, then don't be friends. Just go eat them. So this is probably a little friendlier for single player, but if you want to do it in multiplayer, I think you'll have fun as long as you're very careful at practicing your early game autos, because primals really are complicated there. All right, so here within Joyce's database, I'm going to try to remember to put a link to this down below in the description. We do have Dragon Faldorn, but before we talk about Dragon Faldorn, before we talk about the pieces that we have here, what we're trying to get out of it, how we're going to have to be playing the game in sort of a proactive sense and why, I do think that we need to have a conversation about the Empire tree. So you guys have been pretty good at like finding secret videos on my channel before, so I guess we're going to do a secret video update here for the Empire development tree. But I feel like the old video that I released like 10,000 years ago is so out of date that we really do need to have a conversation, not just about like the ways that you need to think about the Empire tree now, especially in the view of the hero rework, but also just the values of the Empire trees themselves and the values of the picks within them, because that is another really important thing that we kind of skimmed over in the old Empire tree. It's not just about which trees are better, it's also about which picks are better and ways that you can try to influence your ways to get to those good picks without sacrificing your ability to just be as strong as you can whenever you need to be. So without further ado, I guess let's jump in on our secret Empire tree video. So if you don't know how the Empire tree works in Age of Wonders 4, it works on sort of like an accumulation system. So at the end of your turn, any Empire affinity that you have is going to go into a little bucket. That Empire affinity at the beginning of the game is going to be influenced pretty heavily by your build, by the things that you start with in terms of your picks, but as the game plays out, it's going to become influenced more and more by the tomes that you research and the order in which you research them, because again, it's scoring off of those buckets, accumulating over time. You don't lose the bucket scoring, you just lose the Imperium when you unlock them. But what this means is that you can't really judge a tome in a vacuum either, because a tome is inherently linked to your Empire tree, and you really do not want to be just like sitting there brainlessly clicking expanded governance over and over and over again. There are a lot of really good picks in the Empire trees themselves that you need to be on the lookout for. So this is why even on like gigantic maps, you don't generally need more than 5 cities, and 4 is usually enough, because there's just like a lot of great stuff here. But do understand that because each of these trees sort of has like a different focus, we can talk about each of the trees and like try to tier them on their own, but you do need to know that each of them also has like good, or at least good enough picks within them to like think about, and then also understanding the ways that the other players are going to behave based off of their own affinities. So let's talk briefly about the general tree. The general tree's got some really great picks in it. Of course, it does have the expanded governance pick. If you have access to water, then I strongly encourage you to think about picking up seafaring. Being able to go out to sea and clear a bunch of stuff is great for your economy. Road building is, of course, an incredibly powerful tool. Anything that allows you to move faster is always good. Right of the last stand is something that you really shouldn't be clicking intentionally, but if your opponent is trying to rush you, this is one of the better tools for countering that, although it does depend on you having access to good tier 1 units to spawn, so it's not as good with feudal as you would hope whenever it comes to keeping yourself alive. Force March is great. This is just an incredible ability. Don't be too afraid of the exhaust. As long as you're aware of where your opponent is, then just getting extra movement points is always a good thing. Same with siege slots, because you really do not want to be spending 15 turns bulldozing things, and advanced logistics and teleporters. All of those are great, and so what this tells you is that like you really do want to be making progress overall on your Empire affinity, because this scores all of them. This is not just like, you know, which specific things that you have, it's just adding them all up and then scoring them all at once, so that way you can go through here, which is why just like generic research is really good. It'll unlock generic things that are really good and help you make some real progress. So the nature affinity tree here within my own mind is actually balanced against the tomes themselves. I actually really like a lot of the nature tomes. I just think that most of them are like really hyper aggressive, both in terms of the tomes design as well as the design here on the Empire tree of the nature affinity. If you're messing around with nature tomes, you probably are gonna want to play around as Dragon Faldorn and kill people ASAP, because as we dig into these other trees here, you'll realize, oh boy, there's a lot of value on the rest of them and not so much here within this tree itself, which means that the tomes are really going to be underperforming where they are versus the other guys. And that's just like a consequence partially of all the widgets that are associated on this. Like food doesn't really matter. This is fine if you're conquering like 2 free cities, but you kind of need to conquer 2 to be excited about it. Passive healing is pretty ignorable as long as you've done your homework and you have some temporary HP. The Rite of the Guardian Spirit is cool if you can hit it early, but because of the accumulation cost, like you're probably not going to get this where it's like a tier 3 Spirit Wolf and everybody else is running around with tier 1s. Like maybe you'll have a tier 3 and they'll have tier 2s, but you're not going to be able to like brute force one player with one tier 3 unit. The game just doesn't work that way. And then because like there really isn't a big payoff for accumulating nature until Rite of Awakening, you really are going to feel like you're behind if you let people scale away from you, which we'll talk about on these other trees. The best thing for me, I do think, is actually probably Rite of the Awakening. Rangers is cute, but because of the way that friendly units already get faster within their own friendly terrain, this is not as good as I thought it was on the other one, because it is also minimized, like there's a minimum cap. So this is really like the biggest payoff, and it's not even really like a payoff that skips you ahead of the other players. It's really more that one just like catches you up. So this means that if you're playing around with nature, identify whoever is doing their best to scale into the late game and kill them immediately. Otherwise, you're gonna be in a lot of trouble, but at least the tomes themselves support that. So as long as you adjust your behaviors to being like an eco-terrorist, you can get good value on nature, but you need to do that. So let's go talk about Chaos Affinity. This is one I think where my opinions have changed the most, partially because I do think that they've done a good job of upgrading things, but also because I think that this is one of those things that pays you off for being a higher skill player. And when I made the other Empire tree, I had like 300 hours in game, so I did not evaluate some of these things correctly. So let's talk about Chaos Affinity Tree. So one of the things that's complicated about Chaos is that the value here of Call of Chaos changes a lot depending on patch as well as bugs that are associated with a patch. So this is one of these things where like sometimes it's really good, sometimes it's really bad, but it's like always some amount of value that you can be looking for. Just be aware that you do not want to be clicking this if you're not fighting infestations. You need to save your Imperium for things that are good. But speaking of things that are good, this impressment is so much better than where it was. It's crazy. So impressment used to be like an upkeep cost reduction on tier 1 units, which if you play the game enough, you realize is essentially flavor text. Whereas now at tier 1 units getting 50% faster EXP, especially in a universe with a rank rework and like ability to do something like leverage Philosopher Soldiers to generate infinity knowledge, this is a real pick now, and something that you can definitely be excited to play around with, but it is one that does pay you off for either having a specific plan for using it or just killing people, and killing people is fine, like as long as it's a smaller map. Like Rush is fine if it's a 1v1 scenario, so like lean into that. And then, you know, there's some nice little economic picks along the way, but one of the things that has changed in my own evaluation here, like very dramatically, is Rite of Chosen Warriors. I did not really highlight this in the first one because I just wasn't as excited about draft a year and a half ago or whatever, and this really is a big deal. 500 draft on all of your cities is an absurd number of units, and is one of those things that is like also like kind of the king of timing attacks in terms of being able to just brute force enemy players into the ground. If you get up to Rite of the Chosen Warriors and you have enough gold to make a lot of things and you have 4 cities, you're probably going to kill at least one player pretty quickly. You don't really need War Slaves, but Tireless Marchers is obviously insane because of its ability to just keep you moving. You don't have to take it to get good value on Force March, but it doesn't hurt you. And then of course being able to pick up at the final rate, raising cities being faster can actually work really well with particular builds, but it's one of those things where because a lot of the value is loaded kind of like in the middle of the tree, you don't need to have infinity chaos in order to get really good value on the tree. You just need a good plan to get enough chaos to get down to Rite of Chosen Warriors roughly when you're trying to take players out, and then you're just gonna have a really nice time here with Chaos Affinity. I think it's a great tree, and I'm pretty happy to be playing around with it. So the Astral tree remains like one of the strongest, and one of the ways that you can start evaluating the Astral tomes as just generically being stronger because of what it gives you available. So Surge spellcasting, you don't need to take this at the beginning of the game because you're probably not going to be doing a lot of casting in your auto resolves, and even if you are, the AI is not going to get like as much value as you will. But this is one of the strongest things in the game in a big late game PvP fight because of the influence of this. It's not just reducing the cost on mana, it's also reducing the cost on casting points, which means that you can cast bigger, stronger spells, and that's just where you want to be. It's always good to be doing that. So, you know, don't feel like this is 100 Imperium on turn 15 or whatever. This is 100 Imperium on turn 45, but it's the best 100 Imperium on turn 45 you're ever going to spend. But fortunately for Astral, though their first pick is kind of delayable, a lot of the rest of their picks are just unhinged in terms of value. Adaptive Research used to be minus 50%, which was like really nuts in terms of what it gave you, but it's still great, right? You want to be doing research city structures, like that's always a good thing, and then you also get casting points, which are just ridiculously important in the middle phase of the game whenever you're trying to use all of your research in order to dump out the board. You get plus 1,000 mana, you get access to faster research through Astral Inspiration, though it is random. This is still going to help you churn through your pages really quickly. You get Philosopher Soldiers, which just pays you off for having anything that's growing, which is paying you off for fighting. You get gigantic amounts of research from having access to outposts. Like the payoff here really on Astral is almost throughout the entire tree, and that's kind of why when it comes to assessing any sort of build, if you're trying to make your game strong, especially in the late game, you really want to be including Astral, and preferably like a good amount of it, because you really cannot go wrong with having like 9 or 10 Astral on a build. You're just getting good value out of that affinity the entire game. So talking about Materium here in the Empire tree is actually going to be complicated because it does change a lot from patch to patch based off of the value of the first pick alone. The first pick here on Military Engineering has bordered on like insanely OP on different patches. I think right now it's in the healthiest place that I've seen. It's still very strong and you should be very excited about it, but when the game first released, it gave you Palisade Walls automatically on the outpost, which meant that like you could just start with 3 Materium and then just like vomit legitimate, unbreakable outposts onto the board, and it was really frustrating to fight back against. So Triumph decided to switch it over to a work camp, but a work camp is frustrating in other ways. A work camp gives the outpost 2 tiles rather than 1, which, because of the logistical value of extra roads and extra healing, in some ways was even stronger than the palisade walls. Now it's just extra turns off of the outpost and cheaper outposts, and the upgrading is a little faster. That's really still great. What it boils down to is that getting extra tiles is always good in Age of Wonders 4. This is a way to get extra tiles faster and with higher value than something like Fruitful Integration. So just like know that the real strength of Materium Affinity patch to patch kind of matters a lot on what's going on with military engineering. But right now I would say that Materium is probably around chaos level in terms of good value for you. It's got a lot of really cool and interesting and powerful picks, some that are like things that you would maybe want to delay. So Arcane Artisans, for instance, is one of those things like Surge Spellcasting, where like it's not that important in the early game. Even if you have a lot of Materium, you can usually delay it. But by the time you are at the point where you're building some mine SPIs or starting to flip over some of your outposts to mines and things like that, this can allow for ridiculous timing attacks. So do be on the lookout for that. Master Masons also can dramatically speed up the way in which you build stuff in your cities. You do need to be aware that in order to get good value out of this, you do not just need extra production. This also kind of encourages you to have extra gold, because it'll let you build everything even faster if you're going to be leveraging some buy rushing and whatnot. So like it's another one of those picks of like medium and complex value. But as you get deeper in, there's some really nice tempo things like Right of Wealth. Plus 2,000 gold is great when you're doing a bunch of buy rushing. Right now, unfortunately, Specialist Districts is complicated in multiplayer because of Strife. I really hope that in 3 months that this section means nothing, because 0 turn pillaging is not fun, and makes it so that like any sort of SPI strategy is a lot worse in multiplayer than it probably needs to be. But this can be good depending on what's going on with the other rules. Getting access to extra siege project slots is basically always great because of your ability to chew through things. And then Rite of the Dreadnought gives you like a very powerful late game tool for those big powerful fights. So the Materium tree, it's pretty good. I would say it's about on par with the Chaos Affinity, where like if you can get a bunch of it, then you'll feel pretty strong. It's a little worse than the Astral, and as we get down to it, Shadow, but not something that you need to neglect really under any circumstances. Materium can do a lot for you. All right, this video is about to get into like Russian nesting doll levels of insanity, because we're about to do a secret video within a secret video, but that's because of how complicated the Order Affinity tree is. So the Order Affinity tree has been reworked through like meta considerations, not necessarily reworked in terms of the picks that are here, but in terms of the way that free cities work. So in order for us to like dissect why this is complicated and not just skippable nonsense, but actually does have some value, we need to understand what you're going to be doing with free cities in Age of Wonders 4. Generally speaking, you want to kill the free city that is closest to you immediately. Like, just extra fights are always pretty good. And then if you follow like basic precepts of philosophy from the Warring States period, which you probably should be within Age of Wonders 4, it is a war game. You want to conquer your neighbors and ally with the people who are far away from you. So what this means is if you want to use order, then you really want to be on the lookout for ways to do extra scouting early game, so that way you can find a free city that is far enough away that it's just not worth your time to path your army over there to kill them. You want to find a free city who you can naturally work with, and who can power you up. But the thing is that the way that the game tries to encourage you to leverage vassals in the early game here on order doesn't really make sense. Pacification can be pretty solid, especially if you do early scouting really quickly, so that way you can just get a vassal and get free magic materials really quickly, but that is dependent on big time scouting. But tributaries kind of like doesn't make sense within the way that you're going to use free cities, because free cities are going to provide to you resources through their magic materials, but they're really more of a way for you to do resource transformation than resource collection, because now Rally of the Lieges is good. You can use Rally of the Lieges pretty cleanly to recruit like good units from free cities that you're going to work with, and then leverage those units to do faster clearing. Maybe they won't scale with you indefinitely because you're you're not going to be doing all the same kind of racial transformations on your free city units, but it kind of doesn't matter, right? If you can find a tier 3 free city on the other side of the map and start recruiting tier 3 or tier 4 units off of it, your military is going to grow pretty quickly, and that's really good for you. But it means that, like, you don't think about vassals as a way to get stuff. Think about it as more of a way to spend stuff. If you want to support the order affinity tree, get yourself a lot of gold, because you're gonna need it. But even as you dig deeper into the tree, you see that there really are some nice payouts here. Like, Exemplar is really sick if you're trying to do a big timing attack with Rally of the Lieges. Rite of Enduring Duty is probably one of the best pre-combat spells in the game. Like, just, it depends on what you and your friends' rules are, but the rules that we have in Winslay's group, which I do think generically makes sense, are cast your offensive spells first, and then cast your defensive spells. And in that universe, Rite of Enduring Duty can turn fights from looking like they're going to be a disaster to you to looking like you're just going to, like, raffle stomp the opponent. And then as you go down, like, there are some nicer big payoffs as you go deeper into the tree, but be aware that because Rally of the Lieges is not going to scale infinitely for you, it kind of depends on what sort of ancient wonders you're fighting, which is going to also factor into the value of your order affinities. You know, your map gen rules. If you have more ancient wonders to fight, order affinity is just generically better. But, like, this is a very usable empire tree these days, simply because of the value of things, right? Just get yourself some summer fairies and some good units in, like, turn 25-30, and you'll find that your auto resolves are going to go really well for you. And if you can carry some of those cool tier 3 support units that have an AoE cleanse on them, your late game PvP fights are going to be a lot better, I promise. So that leaves the last tree here, Shadow Affinity. So Shadow Affinity is, like, sort of the banner for why High World Threat is not necessarily harder than normal World Threat once you start learning how the game operates, because of things like knowledge extraction. So knowledge extraction is one of those active ways to scale up your knowledge, something that allows you to outpace somebody even if you're, like, balanced on passives, because a plus 150 knowledge per hero killed is a big deal. And on High World Threat there are a lot more like heroes just standing around guarding resource nodes, and so knowledge extraction is even better there. But even in, like, a normal game of Age of Wonders 4, like a normal World Threat, you're still going to end up with a lot of extra heroes that you're able to kill, especially early game, and that's where getting 150 extra knowledge is a big deal, right? Because if you can get ahead on tomes and start collecting extra Empire affinity because you powered through something with research, you're gonna feel it, I promise. And Shadow really doesn't, like, let you down as you go deeper into the tree. There are some skippable things and some things that are context dependent. Like, overall, I'm not a huge fan of All-Seeing, but depending on the build, you can get value. Shadow Binding is also another one of those things that, like, you hopefully don't have to click this until the mid-game or whatever when you're actually getting a meaningful amount of mana, but Winsaya told me a funny story on one of our last multiplayer games where he was forced to start disbanding tier 3 evolved units in order to just keep his mana economy alive. So Shadow Binding can help out under circumstances like that. But then, like, as you go deeper into it, you'll see that some of the scaling does kind of, like, lay kind of flat, especially in comparison to something like Astral, where it's going to just pay you out for, like, you know, doing stuff to the board. Stolen Power is good, but plus 200 knowledge when you're at the, you know, point where you're at, like, 800 knowledge per turn is a lot less impressive than 150 for the first thing. So just be on the lookout that not everything is created equal. But death magic is bananas. This is the extra casting points is just, like, always fantastic, and then extra hero rank is really sick, and extra hero growth is really sick. So there's just, like, great payoffs on the Shadow Affinity, but because a lot of them are contextual and depend on what's going on the board, you do need to be paying close attention. Other than like the base knowledge extraction and then, like, death magic, a lot of the things really are going to depend on how the game is going for you. So I would say that overall Shadow is just, like, very slightly worse than Astral, but other than that, and the fact that nature is still mostly meme nonsense, I think you really can do a lot of different things here within the Empire tree. But because of the different strengths of the different affinities, if you're not playing with something like big Astral and big Shadow, and you're trying to win the game, especially in multiplayer, then that should have a big influence on your own behaviors in comparison to everybody else. So that brings us back to our final section here, which is discussing the build, the Shadow Druids with Dragon Faldorn. So here with the Shadow Druids and Dragon Faldorn, we can kind of express what this build is attempting to do, the pacing that you're trying to observe, and what your strategic plan should be, not just your tactical plan. But the tactical plan, I think, also is gonna help us to determine what we're doing here. So the first thing, of course, is because we are trying to play with primals, we know that we have a pretty big upgrade if we can get to leveraging our Ancestral Wardens. One of the easiest ways I've found to leverage Ancestral Wardens is playing around with Tome of Zeal and Fanatical Workforce. As we highlighted in tier lists in the meta, Fanatical Workforce is one of these things that is generically a lot stronger whenever your early game auto-resolves are weaker, which is a description that is accurate to the primals. So if you want to, make sure that you can get through to those Ancestral Wardens without falling woefully behind, just extra production is great. But Tome of Zeal doesn't just stop there. The Circle of Zealotry gives you extra draft, and whenever it comes to leveraging extra draft, having a good unit that you can do is a big deal. You're probably not going to build the Circle of Zealotry immediately, but once you have that Town Hall 3 online, you're going to be desperately looking for draft, so this fills out that hole for you pretty well. You also have access to a Summon Zealot, you have access to a great damage enchantment, to a great damage booster in Inspiring Chant. So just across the board, I do think that Tome of Zeal offers a lot of value to primals, especially if you're going to be playing around with, the Primal Dune Serpent. We're playing with Scions of Evil, which, a warning here, because you can roll either a shock or a shield unit, you're going to get different things at the beginning of the game sometimes. Yeah, that's okay. Ultimately, I find that the Protector as well as the charge unit are really just the same. You can use them to take extra fights early and level up your Dragon Lord. And then similarly, you're using Imperialists to just try to keep your economy alive and growing until you can get those Ancestral Wardens and then start catching up to everybody else. But a key piece of this is our Dragon Lord, is Dragon Faldorn, because one of the patterns that I've kind of arrived at is just, I think is good, especially in a universe where you can use something like Ambition Challenger in order to make your military grow faster. If you're playing with like really rough early game auto resolves, you can start once your Dragon Lord is like level 4 or level 5, you can start just taking fights with just your Dragon Lord, especially if you're not fighting against polearms, because of like the new Swift. It's just a great option to heal 15 whenever you kill something, and you can do it over and over and over in combat. So Dragon Lords can do a lot of work to alleviate early game military pressure, and that's really what we're trying to do. As long as you can keep yourself alive and keep yourself clearing and keep yourself growing, then you're not going to fall as far behind the people who are using those stronger affinity types. Because you'll notice, like right here on this build, we have 0 Astral and only 3 Shadow, and we don't even get the 3rd Shadow until like our 2nd tier 2 tome. So like, if you are sitting around and waiting for your friends until they get to turn 80, you're dead. You're 100% dead. But that doesn't mean that we can't get great value because of what we need. We don't need to get up to our tier 5 tomes. These are just ambitious. They're there if you want to play a longer game. We just kind of only really need to get up to Tome of Vigor, and even need is a strong word there, because this is a build designed to just pressure your opponents as soon as you can and make it so that the obvious long-term tempo disadvantage of not having the right affinities you can ameliorate with good stuff quickly, supporting your Ancestral Wardens and trying to just either win the game or set everybody far enough back that it doesn't matter. As we grow out of Tome of Zeal, you see we have Tome of Alchemy. It's okay to yawn in the chat, but like, I do think that primals deserve a little bit of TLC in terms of being access to good stuff, and Tome of Alchemy is pretty sweet. But then what we're going to do as we move in is Tome of Glades is going to give us access to Aspect of the Root, which is going to play really well in auto resolves by giving you gigantic ways of temporary HP, but is also going to leverage Bulwark. So in terms of the picks, we have Bulwark, Hardy, and Inner Fire. I just kind of like Inner Fire just generically right now, especially if you're playing on the Umbral Abyss. But because I'm going to encourage people, if they get up to their tier 5 tome, to reset Faldorn into the plant dragon, I kind of figured I needed to do something for everybody to make you less dead to fire damage. So we're playing with the inner fire there, but it means that because of Bulwark, anything that we can do to put ourselves in defense mode, including, for instance, a warrior dragon on permanent defense mode on charges, or, you know, ancestral wardens on permanent defense mode on lunges, or on permanent defense mode on aspect of the root, you're generating a lot of value in terms of tempo whenever you get to click defense mode and also do something. And that's what you want to be getting out of Bulwark. You can use Bulwark with Tome of Constructs, but I don't think we need it here because we're going to do cool stuff with Tome of Shades. One of the bigger issues with ancestral wardens is just, you know, you can shoot them. They do not have shields, but if you blind everybody and you have the ability to leap and stuff, and you have the ability to get haste off of either the Dragon Lord's breath or roar or the level up on Challenger, your ancestral wardens are going to get pretty close to those range pieces pretty quickly anyway. And then Tome of Shades, because we are playing with the Dune Serpent, is a way for us to leverage blind in a way that I hope is going to be creative and fun. The reason though that we're highlighting Tome of Vigor as sort of like this is when you want to be attacking is twofold. First, you do have access to super growth. Super growth on ancestral wardens is really disgusting because of the way that it influences your models and access to extra retaliation attacks, but it also gives you access to summon greater animal. So here, if you don't know how Summon Greater Animal works, don't worry, that's not your fault. It's very weird. But basically, you're not spawning something random. You're spawning something semi-random depending on the map that you're on. So because we're playing with Desert, because of the Serpent, we have access to the Desert selection on Summon Greater Animal, which gives us a 33% chance on Nightmares. Right now, it used to be 50% on Phoenixes, so on older patches this was even better, but it still works. You have a 33% on a Nightmare, a 17% on a Phoenix, and a 17% on an Infernal Juggernaut. This means you have a 2/3 chance of picking up a charge unit, which is going to allow your Ancestral Wardens to be able to have someone breaking defense mode for them, so that way they can just kill things. So that's what you want to be looking for in terms of, like, I'm just going to go all in on folks. Get yourself some Ancestral Wardens, make sure that your early game is not a colossal mess, and so you have enough resources to dump a bunch of Ancestral Wardens onto the board, and then whenever you hit that tier 3 Tome of Vigor, and you get yourself a couple of nice smashy monsters, go kill stuff. We can kind of support the go kill stuff plan through our access to 3 starting order affinity here, but the reason I have that there is just so that if the game goes long enough, you pick up a Tome of Sanctuary for Keeper's Mark and Anointed People. Keeper's Mark is bugged right now, so hopefully they fix that before people start playing with this, because right now it's overpowered and lasting longer than it should. But I just like Keeper's Mark generically with Aspect of the Root, because Aspect prevents you from doing something aggressive, but this keeps you alive, or rather because Keeper's Mark prevents you from doing something aggressive, and then the Aspect will get you back in. And then Anointed People is just like generically always helpful. And then towards the top end is where we're going to just like get really creative, because I do not think that you're probably going to end up with all of this unless you're leveraging your insane amount of knowledge off of killing people with Shadow. But if you do get into Tome of Prosperity, then I would say just have fun, because you can go to Tome of Paradise, pick up Gaia's Chosen, and then because of the way Tome of Goddess of Nature works, the Force of Nature enchantment does not check for unit types. It checks, or rather it only checks for unit types, not unit classes. And if your dragon is a plant and all your people are plants, then Force of Nature is going to work on all of them, and you're going to have a pretty fun and fine time. But really, for Dragon Faldorn, and for any sort of build where you're trying to utilize heavy nature and or heavy order versus people who are using Shadow and Astral, do not plan for a ridiculously long game unless you are proactively attacking people. And that's what this build is designed to do, and hopefully that, you know, if you play around with it and you see that there are different ways to move things around and different ways to keep your Ancestral Wardens as like a big power boost for you, because that really is where the primals are, then I think you're gonna have a really nice time. Oh, and you know, as an aside, if you're attacking people with your summon ability as primals, it's way better to be doing it during Tome of Vigor than to be doing it during like Tome of Goddess of Nature or whatever, right? A tier 2 summon is not going to be doing anything if you're fighting against high tier, high rank units, but it can do some pretty serious work, even against higher rank, lower tier units, just by disabling them with blinds and stuff. So I think that is our Primal general build guide here on the channel. Hopefully you learned a lot. I know that this build was like really weird in terms of discussing all of the other meta considerations going into it, but I think the meta considerations are one of those things where I want you guys to be as creative as possible whenever it comes to finding good solutions for the game's problems that it'll present to you. All right, that's Walker. Take care.